I too am going to start with a bit of historical context. I was a little bit worried about doing that, but I am happy that the introduction that we had did just that. Although I'm going to try to get a little bit. Nope, there we go. So I'm starting though in the United States, and I want to talk a little bit about religious pluralism because this is bigger than Catholics. It's bigger than Christians here. It's really an issue for the whole country. What I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize is that at our colonial founding, we had an enormous amount of religious diversity. And about 8 in 10 people had a religious affiliation then as they do now. And you see here this quote from John Adams listing all the different types of religious faiths that he could identify in the United States. And I think one of the remarkable ones is one of the last there, and he noted atheists, which people see as a relatively new phenomenon, but there have always been atheists in the United States. If you look at a man like Washington, just to pick one of the founders here, he was most likely a deist, someone who believed in a creator, but he didn't have deep Christian roots, apparently didn't believe in an afterlife. But he had some unique ideas about what he should be doing as president. And in his time after at Mount Vernon, he instructed his household staff to provide assistance to anyone who showed up at his door. He said that he wouldn't discriminate on the basis of any religion, and you can read here for yourself. He said he would hire Muslims, Jews, Christians of any sect, and even atheists. A direct quote. One of his, obviously, fellow founders, Ben Franklin, founded a worship space in which he welcomed Muslims to come worship if they so chose to do so. And what I think is really interesting about Washington is there's very few Catholics here at the time in the United States, and many of his troops would hold to British traditions and want to hold a Guy Fawkes Day celebrations. And Washington said, no, you're not going to do that, and prevented them. I don't even know if there were any Catholics in his armed services at that point. Next slide. All of this ends up influencing what kind of government these men of the Enlightenment create. And of course, you see Article 6, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification of any office or public trust under the United States, and the First Amendment, which I don't need to read. This created next slide, a marketplace for religion that is truly unique, very different than what was going on in the rest of the world. So there were so many different religious affiliations that out of self-preservation, the people who decided to create the founding documents said everyone should be able to worship in the faith that they choose or no faith at all, and that it doesn't mean that it was out of any kind of enlightened notion of doing the right thing. In some cases, it was about, look, if I can worship how I please, then I'm going to let them worship how they please. You may not think that they're worshiping in the right religion at the time in the late 18th century, but if you can worship the way you want to and they can worship the way that they can, no one's going to impinge on each other's religious practice or beliefs. Next slide. That quickly faded. It faded on the frontier of the United States, and you had religious revivals, and this country became a really predominantly Protestant country. But then immigration came. And if you look here in the 19th century, you have a huge population growth. So this chart here begins on the left here at 1610, and then ends, I believe, just before the 20th century. And the population just boomed, and a lot of that population were Catholics. Brought new culture, new demands, and that religious pluralism that had been there at the founding, that was in the Constitution and the documents, began to be challenged. And in part, you see a big wave of anti-Catholicism. I'm sure these cartoons, many that you've seen before, ring a bell. It doesn't necessarily ring a bell, I think, in a lot of people's lived experience today, but it's definitely a big part of American history. And Catholics didn't experience the same religious pluralism that the colonists necessarily did. We asked, as a little preview here to the survey, we asked Catholics if American Muslims today face prejudice similar to those American Catholics faced in the past. And you can see a majority of Catholics, 53%, either strongly agreed or agreed. So there's a recognition of, yes, Muslims are experiencing something like we did. At the same time, the rest of the survey's findings depart from there, and even though there is that recognition, we see Catholics showing attitudes that are, as some cases, anti-Islamic as anti-Catholicism was. Next slide. So before I even get to that, I want to show a little bit of data about how Catholics are approaching diversity among Catholics. This isn't religious diversity. These are people all sharing the same faith in Catholic pews. For the Bishops' Conference, Kara did a study in which we essentially looked at different race and ethnicity populations in terms of Catholicism, where they were, and where parishes were that served those specific communities. We then followed that up with in-pew surveys in 29 parishes. This is over 11,000 people that we interviewed during Mass in parishes around the country, and we're looking at different groups here within the pews. We had to translate the survey into 19 different languages. The Catholic Church in the United States today is one of the most diverse institutions that there is in this country. You can see here, this question is, my parish should be more involved in understanding the different cultures that exist within the parish community. And pretty much majorities of many of these groups strongly agree with that statement. The group that doesn't are those of European descent, whose great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents maybe faced the anti-Catholicism in previous parts of American history. You can see a real difference there of non-Hispanic white, only 21% agreeing strongly with that statement. This is, my parish should be more involved in celebrating cultural diversity. You see the same type of pattern going again and again. So this is even Catholics within pews not necessarily wanting to embrace diversity among people who share their faith. So now when I turn to the slides that look at what Catholics think about Islam, if we're challenged here dealing in the pews with people of our same faith, you can imagine that there might be some issues that I want to highlight about Catholic attitudes towards Islam, which may not be very constructive to interreligious dialogue in this country. So that does bring me to this, to Catholicism and Islam today, where we can see some of the survey data specific to this project. Next slide. First, I think it's important to point out what Pope Francis has said, and many of you have heard this, and certainly he's tried to show leadership in how Catholics should approach Islam here. You can see Christians and Muslims are brothers and sisters. Our respect for true followers of Islam should lead us to avoid hateful generalizations. I believe that it's not fair to identify Islam with violence. It's not fair, and it's not true. Next slide. So what we did is Kara is actually not within Georgetown. We are at Georgetown University, but Georgetown University has nothing to do with the research we do. We tended to be hired by clients, including the Bishops' Conference and others. And in this case, a Georgetown Research Center, which is part of Georgetown, the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, asked us to do this survey. It was conducted in April 2015. We interviewed just more than 1,000 self-identified English-speaking Catholics. You might say, well, why did you? We almost never do that. We always do English, Spanish at least. The reason we did English-speaking Catholics is because they were doing a content analysis of Catholic media that was English language only. So to match their content analysis to the population, we had to do that in this case. The first thing that I want to show is something that typically is very, very important. And this is the breakdown of adult Catholics here, English-speaking Catholics, in terms of their religious education. And you can see there's some, 20%, that had none. They had no Catholic schooling. They didn't go to any parish-based religious education. And then you have another combination here of both school and parish-based, a similar size group. And then there's a bigger size that only had parish-based education, and then about a quarter who had Catholic schools and college, or college. So typically what we see is people who've had formal Catholic education tend to know and understand where the church is and understand the church's teachings. They have more awareness on all church documents, which we thought might lead to different opinions. We thought that there would be differences based on whether you had a formal Catholic education or not. The other factors that we tend to look for are Mass attendance, generation. In almost every survey we do, there are huge differences by generation, Mass attendance, religious education. What's going to be remarkable here is not so much. That Catholics across all these things that usually lead to these big differences are not as evident. So first, we asked, to you personally, to what extent does the Catholic Church's teachings about Islam shape your own views about Muslims and their religion? You can see a very small number, just 12%, said somewhat or very much. So what Catholics are saying is, what the Church says about Islam isn't really important to me. I'm not using that. It's not informing what I think. We thought, well, maybe those who had a formal Catholic education would be a little bit different and say, yeah, the views of the Church, I am factoring those in. There's not a lot of difference here. Pretty consistent across different categories. One of the things that does seem to matter is whether a Catholic personally knows someone who is a Muslim or they do not. And sociologically speaking, that's always important. Whenever you know someone in a particular minority or subgroup, you tend to be more empathetic, more understanding. You tend to have a more three-dimensional view of that group by knowing someone than if you don't. And there you're more often using kind of cultural stereotypes. When we asked people who said, yes, I know a Muslim, to characterize who this person was, most often it was a coworker or a friend or a neighbor. You can see 5% said it was a family member that a Muslim had married into their family, and then even a smaller percentage they're saying it was a classmate. We asked, what is your overall impression of Muslims? And you could think of this as, whether you it's presidential approval of Congress, things like that. This is a similar type of question. You can see almost half said, well, I don't really have a favorable or unfavorable view. But if you look at the other slice of the pie here, it's 36% unfavorable and 15% favorable. So that's 21 percentage points underwater. That's what a political scientist would say. That this is a net negative. This is either I don't really have an opinion, but among those who do, it's negative. Here it is based, again, on a breakdown here with differences by whether they have Catholic education or not. And you can see there's not huge differences other than the fact that people who had none are more likely to not really have an opinion. But really that's the only difference. By generation, it is the case that pre-Vatican II Catholics, which is the oldest generation born before 1943, have the highest unfavorables. But if you look at the other end of the spectrum, they also have among the highest favorables. They're just more opinionated. And but the pattern is pretty similar. By mass attendance, again here, you don't see huge differences. And like I said, usually when we do a survey, usually generation, mass attendance, religious education, you see really big differences between these groups. So what this says, it's deeply set in all aspects of the Catholic community. Here, though, is the difference when we look at, do you know someone who is, do you know a Muslim? And here the difference is, if you know someone who's a Muslim, you're 14% percentage points more positive than if you don't. So again, showing you the really salient feature here. But even then, even if you know a Muslim, that is a big difference, definitely statistically significant, but it's still, you have a good chunk here of unfavorable and people who aren't expressing an opinion. So what does the Church teach? I'm sure this is going to be in your discussions this weekend. Declaration from Vatican II in 1965. I'll use the English in our time. The survey found that people have no awareness of this. Your average Catholic has no awareness of this document by name or even allusion to it, even after we describe what it is. That is not unusual. Typically, we did a survey about the Pope's encyclical about climate change. And I think you get something well below 50% having an awareness of it. Even when it's in the news, it's relatively high profile and recent. So here are some of the questions in which we're trying to gauge what do Catholics think Islam is. And here you have the question about, as you understand it, Muslims believe that God is, and we just saw a description in the Catholic document there of what Catholics believe, Muslims believe God is. And of course, wrathful is not there, but 63% of Catholics believe that it is. In terms of what are the practices, beliefs and practices of the Islamic religion, Catholics do better there. They do identify and understand that daily prayer, fasting, and even almsgiving are important. They incorrectly believe, though, to a pretty good number, 87%, they believe that Muslims worship Muhammad. Next slide. We asked here, generally speaking, do you think Islam encourages violence more than other religions around the world, about the same amount or less than other religions around the world? And you can see, and Kara's not the only one who's asked a question like this. Pew has done it, Gallup has done it, I believe. You can see 63% believe that Islam is encouraging violence more so than other religions around the world. And here again, you can see the breakdown here by religious education, and then with nuns simply being more likely to say, I don't know, but a general agreement across the board. Here we asked, which of the following best describes what the female Islamic headscarf, the hijab, is symbolic of? And again, here Catholics do well. They correctly, 67%, say modesty. And this is not from us, this is from the Center for Christian and Muslim Understanding. This is how they read this finding here. And they actually said that Catholics, having this tradition of habit wearing among nuns, may have a better understanding of this than your average American, that they understand the meaning of a headscarf because it's something that has a correlation to something in their own faith. Here it is by religious education. Again, no real significant differences. We asked an open-ended question. So this is not one where they're picking, they got 5 different options and they choose one. Here they're writing in their own words and then we recode it. And we asked people about similarities between Catholicism and Islam. And the 2 top ones here, you can see belief in a supreme being or higher power and a belief that there's only one God. Essentially monotheism is something that Catholics pick up. But most Catholics, you can see, you add these up, these percentages, it's not adding up to a large number. Most Catholics said nothing, that there's no similarities between Catholicism and Islam. And then in terms of interreligious dialogue, we asked how much does each of the following reflect what you believe to be the purpose of interreligious dialogue? And here Catholics again did quite well, to build relationships, to work for peace and justice in our societies, to learn about and grow closer to God, are the 2 that get the highest numbers, and I think everyone would recognize that those are indeed the purpose of interreligious dialogue. In terms of believing in the same God, which is again a question that is, I think, replicated from other work that the center decided to use here. A third agreed that Catholics and Muslims believe in the same God. 42%, a plurality here, disagreed. So the major findings here for the survey is that nearly half of Catholics can't name any similarities between Catholicism and Islam, or explicitly say that there are none. When asked about their overall impression of Muslims, 3 in 10 Catholics admit to having unfavorable views, and Catholics are less likely than the general American public to know a Muslim personally. So switching here to the other half of this study, looking at the content analysis of Catholic media, their point is that what Catholics are seeing in Catholic media influencing these opinions? Can we essentially look to Catholic media and say perhaps this is where some of these negative opinions are coming from? And they looked at 800 articles leading up to when we conducted the survey. And in prominent Catholic outlets, half the time the word Islamic is used, it's reference to the Islamic State terrorist group. The headlines of Catholic articles dealing with Islam have a negative sentiment overall, and the primary emotion conveyed by them is anger. So in terms of cause and effect, Catholic education has little, if any, impact on Catholic attitudes about Islam, which probably says something about what are we learning in our Catholic formal education. Those surveys who consume content from Catholic media outlets have more unfavorable views of Muslims than those who don't. And Catholics are split over whether Muslims have sufficiently condemned terrorism and whether the prejudice faced by Muslims today resembles what Catholics experienced in earlier periods of American history. Just to show you a bit of what they looked at, and again, we were not involved in this part of the project, but they looked at the number of stories, and there is a lot of diversity here in terms of how much the Catholic media pays attention. So Catholic News Agency, National Catholic Reporter, National Catholic Register, America Magazine, were all writing about Islam, significant numbers of stories. However, you can see almost all of them have a net, I won't go over the statistics here, but they essentially create a score and look at how negative they are, the sentiment is on average. Almost all of them are negative, with the website Catholic Culture being the most negative. And if you look at the primary emotion, almost all of them are anger or fear. This is difficult because there's not a lot of Catholics actually who ended up saying they pay attention to these sources. But if you do look at whether these sources affect those who do read these, if it makes them more unfavorable or favorable, most of these, the readers of these publications in the survey, are having more unfavorable views of Muslim than they are favorable. And if you look at kind of the secular media, I think this chart looks like a lot like maybe what one would predict here. We asked about Fox, CNN, and MSNBC, kind of going from leaning right to leaning left. You can put CNN wherever you want. But you can see a pattern here of unfavorable in terms of the top, and then does Islam encourage violence more, less, or about the same as other religions? And Fox News here was tending to people who watch Fox News tend to have more negative sentiment towards Muslims. When we asked about what are perhaps preventing you, or what do you think is preventing more the development of better Catholic and Muslim relations today, you can see that Catholics are more often than not, they're blaming Muslims. So it's the violence and terrorism committed by Muslims. Muslims lack knowledge of Catholicism. Muslims attempting to impose their views on Catholics. And then in the next three, you still get some high percentages here, a majority for the next two, but you can see the top three. Now, my final aside here is how does this matter? And I've been writing a chapter about the election. And I came across a survey. It's the American National Election Study. It's what political scientists like me use to study elections. And they did one in January they did about a year ago. And they asked some questions about candidate preferences and about the issues that were most important to them and their attitudes about Muslims. So this is kind of it gives a window into, all right, if these are the attitudes about Islam, how might that lead to practices within the public sphere? So first, let me explain. Here's the exit polls. Catholics are unique in this country. Protestants vote Republican, majority Republican every election. People with no religious affiliation vote Democrat every election. People of non-Christian religious affiliations vote Democrat, majority Democrat in every election. Catholics are the only ones that go back and forth. It's the only religious group. That's why it's an important swing vote. It's not a block. Catholics don't vote together. But if you win the Catholic vote, you tend to win that little slice that moves things back and forth. It's a key determinant. And you can see here the exit polls say that in 2016, 50% voted for Donald Trump, 46% voted for Hillary Clinton. Back in January, when the National Election Study asked Catholics in a hypothetical head-to-head matchup, it was pretty close to the outcome. Of course, at that point, there's some people that say someone else or probably not vote, but it predicted a Trump victory among the Catholic vote. And when Catholics were asked what were the issues that were important to you in deciding who you preferred to be the nominee, or in that head-to-head matchup, Clinton versus Trump, you can see that the Trump voters here in this column, their number one issue was terrorism and homeland security. The next one was immigration, and then economic growth. So those are the people who preferred Trump as the Republican nominee. And then among all respondents who said they would vote for Trump over Clinton in a hypothetical matchup, again, terrorism and homeland security, immigration, economic growth. Those are the three top issues for Catholic voters who preferred Donald Trump. And then for Hillary, for Catholics who preferred Hillary, you can see Social Security, health care, and unemployment. So if you look at terrorism, homeland security, and immigration, certainly this has an overlap to what I'm talking about tonight and what's happened since the election. The respondents were asked to give feeling thermometers. And these are the groups that they were asked to give feeling thermometers for. And what they're done is they're shown this card. And 0 is I have a very cold or unfavorable feeling about this individual or this group. And then 100 would be I have a very warm or favorable feeling about this individual or group. And if you look all the way to the right, the lowest one, the one that they feel least warm about, are Muslims at 38%, which is just below a bit more cold or unfavorable feeling than warm feeling. The most positive was for police. How well does the word violent describe most members of each of these groups? And you can see here Muslims were the most at 44% in terms of saying that this describes them very or extremely well. And then how much, this again goes to this odd parallel. When you ask Catholics how much discrimination is there in the United States today against each of the following groups, there is again a recognition that yes, Muslims are facing discrimination, just like we had in our survey, but at the same time, responding to a survey in a way that makes one think that perhaps some of that discrimination is coming from the respondents who are acknowledging. So here is, again, why did Catholics pick Trump? Worried that the United States will be experiencing a terrorist attack in the near future. And you can see add up moderately worried, very worried, extremely worried. You get most Catholics. You get a big chunk of Catholics, and that was in part, I think, what built the coalition. Here is, do you favor or oppose allowing Syrian refugees to come to the United States? And you can see here, oppose a great deal, oppose moderately, oppose a little, in terms of being a majority of the slices of the pie here. Here's how Catholics mattered in the election, mattered in a big way. You can see here Michigan. Michigan came down to 48 versus 47 among all voters. So 48 Trump to 47 Clinton. So it was a 1 percentage point win. But if you look at Catholics in the exit polls, 57 to 39. Catholics make up just about 1 in 5 members of that state. If Catholics didn't vote the way that they did in Michigan, and the same thing in Florida, which is also a 1% race, but among Catholics it was 54-44, Hillary Clinton would be president. And one of the ways in which we know that these motivations, obviously, the roots of them, at least in what the national election tells us, was that it was over concerns about terrorism, homeland security, and immigration. Which leads to the executive order, which I think if you parallel this to what I opened with, when I talked about what the founders thought, what George Washington, what Ben Franklin, what those men put in the founding documents, and why they put it there. And it was for everyone. They said Muslim, they said atheist, they said all these non-Christian groups, and those that would have freedom in this country. And this is still happening. This is obviously an issue in the news. And how should the church respond? I am sorry in this context that I'm going to bring up a Jesuit, but my boss is a Jesuit, and I'm surrounded by Jesuits. But next slide. This is what Jim Martin had to say, and I think Jim Martin really kind of put in a nutshell of why he believes what he believes, and why Catholics should be open to welcoming immigrants, refugees. And he says the Gospels are just so clear that we should treat the stranger as if we were him. And that seems like the right thing to do. You read the Gospels, but he takes it a step further. He says here, look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. And he notes that a lot of people don't read this parable close enough. A lot of people think it's the bystander effect. That's what social science talks about, is someone's hurt and a bunch of people walk by and they don't help them. Yeah, that's part of the story. But then he highlights that helping that person was actually at putting themselves at risk on this dangerous road, helping someone who was the enemy for that person at that time. So he does this. He says Jim Martin is kind of paraphrasing what he thinks is going through his head. He says, oh, it might be dangerous, or maybe he does, but he helps them anyway. And he not only helps the man, he binds up his wounds and takes the man to an inn and pays for his stay. So I think what Jim Martin here is saying is, look, no one's being foolish here, that there is danger in possibly in helping the stranger, but a Catholic is called to do it anyway. So what I see in terms of the data across a variety of different sources here, that Catholics clearly, even regardless of their religious education, they are disconnected from the teachings of their faith and the traditions of American religious pluralism. So it's not just that they don't really understand what their church is asking them to do, they don't even understand what this country asked them to do, what the founders were asking them to do. Catholics don't recall anymore, certainly as a lived experience, when they were the strange immigrant group that faced prejudice and discrimination. That's no longer part of our experience. It doesn't seem to impact us. A majority kind of sense, yeah, Muslims face discrimination like we did, but I think there's a loss of understanding of just what we faced.